An Anglican ashore. When he began to stir at 9:30, in the shapeless moments before the return to consciousness, Count Alexander Ilyich Rostov savoured the taste of the day to come. Within the hour, he would be in the warm spring air, striding along Tverskaya Street, his moustaches at full sail. En route, he would purchase the Herald from the stand on Gazetny Lane. He would pass Filipov's, pausing only briefly to eye the pastries in the window, and then continue on to meet with his bankers. But coming to a halt at the curb, in order to let the traffic pass, the Count would note that his lunch at the Jockey Club was scheduled for 2:00, and that while his bankers were expecting him at 10:30, they were, for all intents and purposes, in the employ of their depositors, and thus could presumably be kept waiting. With these thoughts in mind, he would double back and, taking his top hat from his head, open Filipov's door. In an instant, his senses would be rewarded by the indisputable evidence of the baker's mastery. Drifting in the air would be the gentle aroma of freshly baked pretzels, sweet rolls, and loaves of bread so unparalleled they were delivered daily to the Hermitage by train, while arranged in perfect rows behind the glass of the front case would be cakes topped in frostings as varied in colour as the tulips of Amsterdam. Approaching the counter, the Count would ask the young lady with the light blue apron for a mille-feuille, how aptly named, and watch with admiration as she used a teaspoon to gently nudge the delicacy from a silver spade onto a porcelain plate. His refreshment in hand, the Count would take a seat as close as possible to the little table in the corner where young ladies of fashion met each morning to review the previous evening's intrigues. Mindful of their surroundings, the three damsels would initially speak in the hushed voices of gentility, but swept away by the currents of their own emotions, their voices would inevitably rise, such that by 11:15, even the most discreet enjoyer of a pastry would have no choice but to eavesdrop on the 1,000-layered complications of their hearts. By 11:45, having cleaned his plate and brushed the crumbs from his moustaches, having waved a thanks to the girl behind the counter and tipped his hat to the three young ladies with whom he had briefly chatted, he would step back onto Tverskaya Street and pause to consider. What next? Perhaps he would stop by Gallery Bertrand to see the latest canvases from Paris, or slip into the hall of the conservatory where some youthful quartet was trying to master a bit of Beethoven. Perhaps he would simply circle back to the Alexander Gardens, where he could find a bench and admire the lilacs as a pigeon cooed and shuffled its feet on the copper flashing of the sill. On the copper flashing of the sill. Ah, yes, acknowledged the Count. I suppose there's to be none of that. If the Count were to close his eyes and roll to the wall, was it possible that he could return to his bench just in time to remark, "What a lovely coincidence," when the three young ladies from Filipov's happened by? Without a doubt. But imagining what might happen if one's circumstances were different was the only sure route to madness. Sitting upright, the Count put the soles of his feet squarely on the uncarpeted floor and gave the compass points of his moustaches a twist. On the Grand Duke's desk stood a champagne flute and a brandy snifter. With the lean uprightness of the former looking down upon the squat rotundity of the latter, one could not help but think of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza on the plains of the Sierra Morena, or of Robin Hood and Friar Tuck in the shadows of Sherwood Forest, or of Prince Hal and Falstaff before the gates of— But there was a knock at the door. The Count stood and hit his head against the ceiling. "One moment," he called, rubbing his crown and rummaging through his trunk for a robe. Once suitably attired, he opened the door to find an industrious young fellow standing in the hall with the Count's daily breakfast, a pot of coffee, 2 biscuits, and a piece of fruit, today a plum. "Well done, Yuri. Come in, come in. Set it there, set it there." As Yuri arranged the breakfast on top of the trunk, the Count sat at the Grand Duke's desk and penned a quick note to one Konstantin Konstantinovich of Donovsky Street. "Would you be so kind as to have this delivered, my boy?" Never one to shirk, Yuri happily took the note, promised to relay it by hand, and accepted a tip with a bow. Then, at the threshold, he paused. "Shall I leave the door ajar?" It was a reasonable question, for the room was rather stuffy, and on the 6th floor there was hardly much risk of one's privacy being compromised. "Please do." As Yuri's steps sounded down the belfry, the Count placed his napkin in his lap, poured a cup of coffee, and graced it with a few drops of cream. Taking his first sip, he noted with satisfaction that young Yuri must have sprinted up the extra 3 flights of stairs, because the coffee was not 1 degree colder than usual. But while he was liberating a wedge of the plum from its pit with his paring knife, the Count happened to note a silvery shadow, as seemingly insubstantial as a puff of smoke, slipping behind his trunk. Leaning to his side in order to peer around a high-backed chair, the Count discovered that this will-o'-the-wisp was none other than the Metropole's lobby cat. A one-eyed Russian blue who let nothing within the hotel's walls escape his notice, he had apparently come to the attic to review the Count's new quarters for himself. Stepping from the shadows, he leapt from the floor to the ambassador, from the ambassador to the side table, and from the side table to the top of the 3-legged bureau, without making a sound. Having achieved this vantage point, he gave the room a good hard look, then shook his head in feline disappointment. "Yes," said the Count after completing his own survey, "I see what you mean." The crowded confusion of furniture gave the Count's little domain the look of a consignment shop in the Abate. In a room this size, he could have made do with a single high-backed chair, a single bedside table, and a single lamp. He could have made do without his grandmother's Limoges altogether. And the books? All of them, he had said with such bravado. But in the light of day, he had to admit that this instruction had been prompted less by good sense than by a rather childish impulse to impress the bellhops and put the guards in their place. For the books were not even to the Count's taste. His personal library of majestic narratives by the likes of Balzac, Dickens, and Tolstoy had been left behind in Paris. The books the bellhops had lugged to the attic had been his father's, and, devoted as they were to studies of rational philosophy and the science of modern agriculture, each promised heft and threatened impenetrability.